All right, so it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Steve Furlanetto today. For those of you who don't know, Steve is spending his sabbatical year here, on sabbatical from UCLA. What's a sabbatical? You can ask him later. It's kind of unusual. So Steve's career has had him oscillating from left coast to right coast. He did his PhD with Avi Loeb at Harvard. After that, moved to Caltech as a prize fellow in theoretical astrophysics, where he spent 3 years, and then back to the other side, to Yale as a professor, and then a few years later, in 2008, he moved to UCLA, where he's been ever since. Steve is really a pioneer in the theory of the 21 centimeter cosmology and how we can use that to study reionization, and that's what he's going to tell us about today.
Thanks, Andrew. So it's a pleasure to be here, both to talk to you today and to be here for the year, if only because my house is at the top of Lake, so this is a much, much better commute for me. So I'm going to talk today about the high redshift universe, the first generations of galaxies that formed and what they did to the universe around them. And I'm going to try to hit these 4 questions with varying degrees of detail. This will be mostly a theory-oriented talk, but I'm going to do my best to connect it to the observations we have and that we hope to have in the relatively near future. All right, so here is a timeline of the history of the universe with the Big Bang on the left over here and today on the right. And the aspect of cosmology that has always interested me is basically telling the story of the structure that fills the universe and how we get from the very simple very smooth universe in the first few 100,000 years to the very complex structures we see today. And of course, astronomers over the past 80 years or 90 years, I guess, have been pushing farther and farther back in time to look at more and more distant galaxies. And now, as we'll see, the most distant galaxies that have been well studied, or reasonably well studied, are at redshifts of about 8, so they existed close to about 1 billion years after the Big Bang. In the entirety of those 13 billion years from redshift of 8 to today, galaxies have certainly changed, but they haven't changed in any sort of qualitative ways, I don't think. The stars that fill them, at least as far as we can tell, are perfectly consistent with the stars around us today. The structures are smaller, they're growing more violently, they're interacting more strongly, but the same basic processes are driving them. And as I'll show in a little bit, the same kinds of, at least simplified approaches you use to describe galaxies today work even at the most distant ones we can see. But somewhere before that point, right, we went through some transition from this truly simple universe to complex structures forming. And that is what we call the cosmic dawn. And it has attracted a lot of interest from theorists in the past about 20 years. And we are very fond of telling you stories about how these first stars may have appeared and the many physical processes that may have affected them until you're able to finally form the first galaxies through some set of coincidences or whatnot. I'm not going to tell you such a story today because, as it turns out, we have very few observational ways to get a handle on these very, very early structures in the next, say, 10 years at least. So we are aiming instead to understand a slightly later part of this story, which we call reionization. So reionization is basically the landmark event that describes these first generations of structures. You have these galaxies forming, they produce ionizing photons through massive stars or black holes or something like that. Some of those ionizing photons leak out into the universe around them and produce little H2 regions. As you get more galaxies and bigger galaxies, these H2 regions grow and merge and eventually fill the universe. Okay? So this is a phase transition in the history of the universe, one of very few of them. And its properties, as I'll try to show you today, have a lot to say about not only how the universe as a whole is evolving, but how the galaxies that are producing these ionizing photons live. Okay, so that's the goal, is to understand both the phase transition itself and the sources that are driving it. All right, so before I move on, I want to talk very briefly about how a very basic intuitive model for how we understand how reionization happens. Since the first simulations of reionization, people have talked about 3 phases that it goes through. The first one is what you're seeing now. It's called the pre-overlap phase. Okay, and you're getting ionized bubbles that are going to grow in isolation, whatever that means, okay? So basically there are so few galaxies around that you're getting little tiny bubbles that are growing. At some point, those bubbles start to overlap with each other, okay? And then you get giant structures that can grow very quickly through the mergers of neighboring big bubbles. And then in the end stages, you've flipped from having isolated bubbles in a sea of neutral hydrogen to having a sea of ionized hydrogen and isolated neutral bubbles that you finally eat away, okay? So our modeling sort of divides the universe into these three phases. The first two you can kind of treat together. The last one I will talk about at the end today. All right, so why should you care about reionization? Well, as I said, it's one of the very few truly global phase transitions in the history of the universe, at least the ones that we can observe. Because it turns out this very likely happens very quickly. So within about a Hubble time, the majority of hydrogen in the universe goes from being neutral to ionized, so pretty quickly. So just from a fundamental level, the fact that this is one of those major phase transitions makes it interesting, at least to us theorists. It also has effects on future generations of galaxies. So you ionize the gas, okay, and that requires 13.6 electron volts, but your photon typically has 15 or 16 eV. And so you get a couple of extra eV worth of energy in your electron, which then thermalizes and heats the gas to 20 or 30,000 Kelvin. Right? Before reionization, it was very likely maybe 100 or 1,000 Kelvin. So it's a huge amount of heating that you get. And along with that increased heating, you increase the pressure and hence the Jeans mass of the gas. And so that's going to affect how baryons are able to accrete on later generations of galaxies. Right, so one application of that is to understanding the very small satellites that have been discovered recently about the Milky Way, which appear to have these very old stellar populations. So one popular explanation for that, amongst others, is that these galaxies were able to form stars before reionization because the gas around them was cold. But once the universe was heated, they could no longer accrete new material, and so their star formation got choked off. Okay? All right. There's another aspect of this phase transition that's useful, which is that at this time, about 95% of the gas in the universe is outside of galaxies. And the galaxies, most of the gas that is in galaxies are in tiny, tiny little faint things that are very hard to image individually. Okay? So it may be possible to observe the 95% of the baryons doing something and infer the properties of the galaxies than the other way around. For example, this set of simulations from Matt McQuinn shows 4 different numerical simulations of this reionization process. Each column is a different simulation, and this is early, middle, and late phases. So the white blobs here are the ionized gas, and the black is neutral. And the difference between these simulations is in the galaxies that are doing the ionizing. Basically, from left to right, we are going from very small galaxies that are doing most of the ionizations to massive galaxies that are doing it. All right? And so as you see, these ionized bubbles are changing in their character as you go from left to right. Right? And that's not because an individual galaxy is producing this entire bubble. Okay? This simulation, I think, is about 100 megaparsecs across. And in these bubbles, there are hundreds to hundreds of thousands of galaxies. Right? It's actually driven by the clustering of the underlying sources. Right? So by measuring the progress of this structure, you can figure out the galaxies that are doing it, or properties of the galaxies that are doing it, even if you can't see them. All right. So in order to model the reionization process, the first thing we need to know then is as much as we can about that galaxy population. And that's where I'm going to start today. All right. So as I mentioned, we have measurements of reasonable numbers, by which I mean at least 100 galaxies at redshifts of 7 and 8 now, mostly coming from very deep fields like the UDF programs and GOODS and things like that. And these are plots of the luminosity functions at redshift of 7 and 8. Okay? And you can see the Schechter function is reasonably well characterized. The uncertainty at this point is in the faint end. So L star, right, is somewhere around here, and you don't get much leverage on figuring out exactly what that faint end is. And that's important because it turns out to be very steep. So alpha is about minus 1.9. Minus 2 is formally divergent. Okay, so it actually matters quite a bit how close you are to minus 2. But because this is so steep, all right, no matter what its exact value is, turns out that most of the light is coming from galaxies that we probably can't see. okay, as long as this luminosity function extends a reasonable distance below the current limits. So faint galaxies are the dominant players, we think, in the reionization process. All right, now these, those of you who study galaxies, you know a lot more than me, which is good from my perspective, because that means I can treat things really simply without feeling so bad about it. So we tried to model, we being an undergraduate at UCLA, Jason Sun and I, tried to basically make an inference of how galaxies are working based on this luminosity function, these observed luminosity functions. And we used a very simple technique called abundance matching. And the basic idea is you take the luminosity function and you pick a luminosity, and that gives you a number density of those galaxies in the universe. And you simply match that to the dark matter halo that has the same number density in the universe. And so you get a mapping from dark matter halo to your galaxy population. Okay? And then we wanted to figure out how efficiently these things are forming stars as a function of either the luminosity that you're observing or the mass. I'm presenting it here in terms of mass. And this is that star formation efficiency. So there's two other theoretical inputs you need, which first is the accretion rate at which these halos are growing. Okay, so this star formation efficiency is going to be the fraction of that accreted gas that's actually turned into stars. Right? And then you need to assume something about the stellar populations in order to go from the luminosity to the basically star formation rate. And we assume sort of vanilla for this. It's going to change the normalization, but not the shape, as long as the stellar population is constant. All right, so what you find, the red line here is fitting to the redshift of 6 luminosity function. The blue is fitting to the redshift of 8 luminosity function. We find that there's a peak efficiency that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%. All right? And it declines at both lower and higher masses. That is qualitatively similar to what you get when you apply this technique to the much better observed lower redshift galaxy populations. Okay? And the location of the peak, somewhere between 10 to the 11 and 10 to the 12 solar masses total, is reasonably close to what you get at lower redshifts as well. So that implies that basically to the limit of the observations, these observations anyway, the way in which we understand low redshift galaxy formation probably applies to these things that we're seeing at redshifts of 7 and 8. All right. Doing this modeling allows us to do a couple of interesting things. Okay. One is since we have this relationship, there's not a huge dependence on redshift, but there is some. Right? We can then extrapolate it to higher redshifts. Right? There are measurements of galaxies at redshifts of 9 and 10, just a handful of them, but this relationship, if you apply it to the theoretical halo populations at redshift 9 and 10, works okay. If you go beyond that, you can start to make predictions for things like what JWST will see when it does deep fields. And it turns out that unless you are very optimistic about what is happening below the threshold of the observations, which is about here, okay, then it turns out JWST will probably miss most of the light at redshifts greater than 10, even in million-second integrations. Right? Now, it is very uncertain what is going to happen at these lower redshifts, okay? At those lower halo masses. So at low redshift, it turns out what happens is the decline in these solid curves just continues, okay, quite steeply. And that's thought to be due to supernova feedback or something like that. Yes?
Just for a second.
Yes, please.
With point sources, yeah, you're saying you won't detect point sources. How much further can you go looking for brightness fluctuations, things like that?
That's a very good question, and I'm not actually sure.
I'm not sure it's enough to negate the point, but it's not the only way to look for
Yeah.
things discretely.
Yeah. So there was just a paper on AstroPH late last week, I think, about doing this with Hubble. And they claim that they could figure out about the fainter galaxies, but I haven't looked closely at it. Yeah, it's a good idea. And of course, the other thing you can do is do a lensing survey or something to go farther down the luminosity function. Okay, so, of course.
Star formation efficiency, what do you mean? Is that 10% of the baryons accreted through those halos?
Exactly, yes. All right, so one thing you can assume, which we call model 3, is that you get a steep fall off like you do at lower redshifts. The most optimistic thing you could assume we're calling model 1, which is that it's just constant star formation efficiency below the limit of the observations now. And then we have an intermediate case, this model 2, where it's just a power law decline, which is still fairly steep, but not quite as bad. All right. OK. So the reason to do this is because of, on that, I guess my third slide or so, I had that long list of processes that theorists think matter at high redshift. Those are important in the small halos because they're so fragile. And since we can imagine that any one of those can do any of these three things, we're just being open-minded right now. All right. All that said, I should mention that when you look in detail at redshift of 6 galaxies, there are some hints that things are working differently than they are at lower redshifts. So my former postdoc, Joey Munoz, did some modeling, kind of the ISM level of very bright radio sources seen in CO and C2. And the physics that you use to make to understand those that kind of emission from low redshift galaxies does not seem to consistently describe what's going on at high redshifts. But we don't have an answer for why that is. It's just a hint that something is changing. All right. So the other thing interesting that you can do now that you have a model for how galaxies are forming is turn that into a prediction for how the universe gets reionized. Basically, from the galaxy model, you can say how many ionizing photons you're producing at any given redshift. Okay? And so that prediction is plotted here. So redshift down here, and this is neutral fraction. So the universe starts off neutral and becomes ionized. All right, so people have spent a lot of effort trying to measure that neutral fraction at around a redshift of 6 or 7, and that's what all these blue points are. I'm not going to get into them because I don't trust any of them individually. They are all, except for one here, upper or lower limits, and it turns out they're all dominated by how you do the modeling. So there are unknown systematics affecting those limits. Okay, but if you do take them at the papers at face value, okay, this solid and dashed curves here, okay, are consistent with all of those, okay, measurements, and are basically those are predictions from models 2 and 3, which are these ones where the star formation efficiency is falling off pretty steeply, okay. So in that case, okay, you are having quite rapid reionization. It ends at around redshift 6 here. And it gets underway, really doesn't get underway until about a redshift of 10. Now, it's easy to extend it to last longer, okay? But that's not required by the data. And basically, in order to do that, you're going to assume that the physics of galaxies change at high redshifts. So model 1, which is the one with the constant star formation efficiency at low masses, gives you a much more extended reionization epoch because those smaller galaxies are easier to form at the very high redshifts. All right. Another possibility is you add some kind of new population of stars. Okay, so in this magenta curve, what we do is add in, basically allow very small halos to form very massive population 3 stars at some low efficiency. Okay, and because those small halos are forming out at redshifts of 15 and above, you extend how reionization occurs, how long reionization takes. So those are allowed by all available data, those kinds of things. But we can also develop a consistent picture of reionization in which no exotic processes happen whatsoever, essentially. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to move on and discuss, given some galaxy population, okay, how would one model reionization? Now, in the rest of the talk, basically, I'm going to be assuming we know what those galaxies are doing. Obviously, that's not the case. Okay, but in our mind, we can turn it around and say, well, if we measure how reionization is working, then we can reverse engineer it and learn something about those unknown galaxy populations. Okay. All right, so when I say model the process of reionization, what I mean is come up with some way to describe what we call the morphology of the ionized gas. Okay, where these big ionized bubbles are appearing, how big they are, how they overlap, all those kinds of things. Okay, so that was first done with numerical simulations, but about a decade ago we developed an analytic model that we thought, at least, could describe how these ionized bubbles are growing. And it's really quite simple at its core. It's a photon counting model. So you take a galaxy, all right, and remember we're assuming we know how this galaxy works, so we can say how many ionizing photons it's producing. And then some of those ionizing photons stream out into the universe around them and generate an ionized bubble. And to get the volume of the bubble, we just compare the number of ionizing photons to the number of atoms in that bubble, right? And assume that every photon ionizes an atom. So you get your bubble around your galaxy. Okay, that's easy. The complicated part turns out to be the fact that these first galaxies are highly clustered with each other because they're so rare, and these ionized bubbles are quite big. So usually, very quickly, your ionized bubble overlaps another galaxy's ionized bubble. And then you have this overlap region right here where you have extra photons that have ionized atoms twice, and so you want to spread them out. And then your bubble gets a little bigger and starts overlapping more galaxies, and it's hard. Okay. But if you turn the problem around, it turns out to be analytically tractable. Okay, so rather than work from one galaxy outwards, you just basically choose a big sphere in the universe, and you ask if all of the galaxies contained within this sphere have produced enough photons to ionize the whole thing. If the answer is yes, then you're done because reionization is over. If not, you start zooming in, okay, until the answer is yes. And so that tells you the maximum size of ionized bubble of which your galaxies can be part of. And so it's automatically incorporated this clustering problem by working from the outside in, okay? There are two convenient things about this. Okay? The first thing is that the argument, although we initially presented it as an analytic model, can very easily be applied to realizations of the universe. Okay? So this pretty simulation that I showed at the beginning from Marcelo Alvarez was actually generated with exactly the argument I just gave you. It's not doing radiative transfer or anything like that. It's just zooming in on galaxies identified with linear theory and drawing ionized bubbles around them as they grow. And there are a number of people who have written, who have made versions of that. So my former postdoc, Andre Messinger, wrote two, one called DEXM, which is complicated, and one called 21 centimeter fast, which is slightly less complicated. But they're both publicly available for anybody to use and do these calculations. Yes.
Is that a good approximation?
Yeah. So as long as the, right, so the mean free path of an ionizing photon at the ionization threshold is kiloparsecs. And this box is like 400 megaparsecs across. So the thickness of the ionization front is essentially negligible. If you have stellar sources. If you have quasars or something like that, the X-rays can get a lot farther and things become much fuzzier. And then this model doesn't work very well.
Okay. I mean, I was just thinking if you just had a bunch of ionized electrons and then you have UV photons, they're going to be bouncing over that mean free path. And there's going to be...
So yes, well, so the optical depth of Thomson scattering is a fraction of a percent. Okay. So the scattering is very weak. All right, and I should also say that these, we call this a semi-numerical model. And these, if you compare it to a radiative transfer simulation of reionization, it actually fares very well. So you get 90% of the information in a 5-minute calculation on a laptop compared to a big radiative transfer code that runs for a month on a large cluster. And I think those codes don't even include diffusion either. So you do pretty well. It's fun. The second thing is, it turns out that the mathematics behind this is called the excursion set formalism, and it's the same way that you generate the dark matter halo mass function. And so you can use all the same machinery to describe this, and you can produce something like a ionized bubble mass function. We present it in terms of radius and or volume instead of mass, but it's the same idea. Right? And so we produced this nice plot which showed the size, this shows the fraction of the ionized volume that is in bubbles of a given size at a sequence of points during reionization. Right? So this one is about 2/3 of the way through. This one is about 1/3 of the way through. Okay? And the takeaway from this was that the ionized bubbles get very big very quickly, okay? But that they have this really nice, well-defined characteristic scale that you could then go out and try to measure and understand reionization better. Okay? And it was a really nice result, and I was very proud of it. But unfortunately, it turns out that it's wrong, as all nice results inevitably are. This is some recent work by one of Peng O's students. And so what they did was they went into these semi-numerical simulations of reionization, and they actually tried to measure how big these bubbles get. Okay? The black line here is the prediction from the excursion set model. All right, and then the red and the blue lines are different measurements of the size, different ways of measuring the size. Okay, so in these cases, it turns out you do get a characteristic scale, but it's several times what you expect from the analytic model that we had many years ago. Okay, so why is that? All right, well, if you look a little more closely at how reionization ought to be working, it turns out to be both simpler and more complicated than we had expected or understood before. And so one of the things I've been doing lately is applying the results from a field called percolation theory to understand this process. So in percolation theory, what you do is you pick some space, usually represented as a grid. Okay, so this two-dimensional thing would be it. And you divide it into some lattice, and then you randomly populate the cells of the lattice, okay, with, in our case, ionized bubbles. All right, so this is, you can imagine, a slice of a universe that is being ionized in some abstract way. Okay, as you fill the space in some random fashion, okay, you generate clusters. What percolation theorists call clusters, which are the discrete chunks, okay, connected chunks of the lattice. And so percolation theory is the study of how these clusters grow as you populate the space. Right? And this is a quite mature field, it turns out. So it was invented by polymer chemists trying to figure out how polymers form in the 60s. But the mathematicians are interested in it because it has a phase transition, as I'll talk about in a minute. Geologists care because this is roughly how oil is distributed underground. And condensed matter physicists care because you can use this to describe layers of things with impurities or whatnot. Okay. All right, so I want to go over some key results that percolation theory shows us and how they apply to reionization. All right. The first thing is the word percolation in here, right? Your coffee pot percolates when the water at the top of the filter wanders through this sludge of, I don't drink coffee, so I can use that. The water wanders through and makes it to the bottom. That's percolating, okay? So you say that this space percolates if you can get from one end to the other only going through, in this case, the black regions. And so if you study this for long enough, you would realize, and you could probably just tell intuitively, that you can't get from one end to the other only traveling through black squares here. Here it's very easy, okay? And this middle point, there's precisely one way to do it, and it's this red one, okay? And that, it turns out, is a generic result of percolation, okay? Now, this two-dimensional case is not reionization. Okay? What we want to picture for our purposes is more like a Rubik's Cube, all right, where you're painting the little cubes inside the Rubik's Cube. So I'm going to be presenting results from our cubical simulations that are divided into little cells just like this. All right? But the same thing happens. Okay? You develop what's called a percolating cluster, which in a finite box means goes from one end to the other. But it turns out it has been proven mathematically that at some point, as you fill your box with ionized bubbles, you develop an infinitely long ionized network, okay, that would span even an infinite space, okay? And that cluster always appears at a well-defined threshold. So this is showing the probability, so this is ionized fraction down here, and this is showing the probability that any ionized cell in your cube is a member of this infinitely large ionized, or infinitely long ionized network, okay? So the network does not appear, in this case, until an ionized fraction of 0.3116. But once it appears, notice that it grows very rapidly. And by an ionized fraction of 1/2, okay, almost all, 90-some%, of your ionized cells are actually part of that one unique, infinitely long cluster, okay? So this immediately, so provided that this happens in reionization, and I should say that to generate this plot, I've just randomly plopped in ionized bubbles. I haven't done anything with galaxies. Okay, so provided this happens during reionization, this changes the way in which we should think about these structures growing. Rather than grow as some discrete ionized bubbles that have some characteristic size, in fact, once this happens, they're all one big clump.
Question?
Yes?
Whether this characteristic transition point depends on how you ionize. Whether, say, one scenario is you randomly ionize elements, or you only
Yes. So in general, so I'll answer that in 1 second, but with a plot. But in general, the point at which this infinite percolating cluster appears depends on how you construct your lattice. So for example, the cubes, you can do it with cubes, and it'll be one number. You can do it as pyramids, it would be a different number. So the value at which this appears depends on how you formulate your problem. But it turns out, and this is the reason that mathematicians are ultimately interested in it, many other properties of these percolating systems don't depend on those details. They only depend on the dimensionality of the system. Right? So for example, the rate at which this infinite ionized cluster grows turns out to be universal. So for any three-dimensional lattice, without large-scale correlations, it will grow at the same rate. And that's what this inset is showing. This is the expected power law, the ionized fraction minus the value at the threshold to the 0.41 power, right? And we get this straight line near the threshold, which is exactly what it is in every truly random percolation problem in 3 dimensions.
Steve, there's something very simple, I guess I'm missing, and that is, why doesn't, you said there's exactly one path that all doesn't develop, given the 3-dimensional structure, a second and a third, and then somehow?
It's been mathematically proven that it cannot, which is odd. I totally agree with you. But we'll see it in a minute. I'll show you some examples of how this is happening. Yeah.
In a way that one channel grows until it
Just
takes up.
swallows up everything. Yeah. All right. So here is a plot. So again, this is just randomly populating cells in a 3-dimensional system. Okay. This is doing those semi-numeric simulations of reionization and watching for the appearance of this infinite cluster and then tracking its growth. And so I did this in 5 different simulations. Those are the lines up here, okay? And you can see that when the ionized fraction is very small, right, there is no infinite cluster, but it rapidly appears at about an ionized fraction of about 0.1, it turns out, and grows, and again, takes up most of the space later on. Probably can't see it. There's a green line here. Okay, this is the threshold in the random case. Okay, so the threshold has gone down a lot, and there are 2 reasons for that. One is in the real universe, we're not populating squares. We can only populate squares. We have galaxies that can be arbitrarily close together, so it's called continuum percolation, and in general that makes it easier to connect things, so it reduces the threshold. And the second is that we have large-scale correlations, which we'll see the importance of in a minute. Okay, so this is percolation is happening in our boxes, okay, and indeed we have this that almost all of the ionized material is inside of a single structure. This was actually noticed almost a decade ago by Ilya Ilyev in his simulations, but nobody knew what to make of it, so it hasn't been developed farther since then. All right, so this is an image of how this percolation occurs in the semi-numeric simulations. So this is our 3D rendering of our box, okay. The red and the blue are both ionized structures. Right? The blue is the stuff that is part of the percolating cluster. The red is all of the other stuff that is inside of finite clusters. And this is 0.0883, is right at the percolation threshold. So this has just appeared in this particular box. Okay. Here is an ionized fraction of 12%, and you can see that it has grown tremendously. Okay. It is basically linked up with other ionized bubbles. Okay, and so started to fill all of space and not just one long chain. And by a quarter of the way through reionization, it's essentially dominant. All right. Now, although this was in the Ilyev simulations, nobody has actually noticed this effect before, largely because we, in our papers, tend to present things in 2D. And in 2D, this is it's impossible to notice. So here's when the universe is 10% ionized. I've taken a slice through this same simulation. The stuff that is light gray is neutral. The stuff that is white is all part of this infinite ionized network. Okay, and even at 22% ionized, I would not have guessed at all that these things were all connected in some way. Right? It's only when you get much later in the process that you might be able to guess that. All right. So one of the other interesting results you get from percolation theory is that at the threshold, while you are developing this infinitely large cluster, the problem goes scale-free. Okay, so you can again predict what the shape. This is plotting the size distribution of the clusters that you're getting in your box. Okay. At the percolation threshold, or slightly below, you should be following a power law, which is given by the blue dotted line here. All right, and the red lines are just above and just below the threshold, right, what we find in simulations. This is of random, purely random ionization. Okay, so you're following this, you're developing a power law, you have no characteristic scale whatsoever. Below the threshold, these black curves are showing you what you get below the threshold, and it also follows the power law, but there's some break. Okay, so as you approach the percolation threshold from below, you're building bigger and bigger objects, but basically following this universal distribution. In our boxes, we also get a power law. Okay, so I'm presenting this in a different way. Okay, but a straight line is a power law. And again, the two red curves are just above and just below our percolation threshold, and you can see that it is more or less a straight line. And below the threshold, it also follows that straight line, okay, up to some cutoff scale. Okay. Interestingly, it is a different power law than you get in the randomly percolating case, and that's because we have these long-range correlations that affect the growth of these things. So if you can see, there's a green curve here, which is falling off a little bit more steeply than ours. Okay. The shape that we end up with, for I don't think any particularly good reason, or I don't understand where it comes from anyway, is that you get equal contributions to the filling factor per logarithmic interval in volume. Okay, so that means that not only do we have a power law with no characteristic scale, we have a flat power law such that all sizes contribute equally, right? And contrast that with that expectation from that analytic model where there is this well-defined characteristic scale. Okay, so something is weird. I should also say that percolation theory has been applied to large-scale structure of the density field by Shandaran and collaborators over a few papers, and they actually find the same shape in the size distribution of voids. Okay, so it appears to be something that's coming from the underlying density field. All right, now with that said, okay, in order to make my ionized bubbles here, I have basically said that any connection is sufficient to put you in the same ionized bubble. All right, so what it turns out happens, though, is that you get kind of blobby regions that are connected by narrow tunnels to other blobby regions. Okay? And so that's why when you actually measure the size distribution in some way that might be more observationally accessible than my sort of ideal case, you sort of measure the sizes of those blobby regions and you ignore the tunnels. And so in that case, you do get, in the measurements, a characteristic scale. It's not the characteristic scale you expect from galaxy clustering. Okay, so it has something to do with percolation and something to do with clustering, but we haven't figured out yet what that is. All right. Okay, so then I want to pause now and talk a little bit about how we hope to observe these structures. Okay, and I think that the most exciting way to do this, because these are structures in the neutral IgM, is looking at the 21 centimeter line of neutral hydrogen. That has a few advantages. So it's a spectral line, which means that each observed wavelength corresponds to a different distance from us, and so we can actually map out the time history of reionization. And in principle, we could construct a movie like this, right, where the blue stuff, purple stuff, is showing you the emission from the 21 centimeter line, and the black blobs are the ionized bubbles that are growing. Okay. The other advantage is that it is directly measuring the intergalactic gas. So almost every other probe of reionization requires you to interpret something else before you learn about reionization, either some line from galaxies or something about the CMB. Whereas this is a very clean view of exactly what's happening with the reionization process itself. All right. However, we can't, and we are not envisioning actually making high-resolution movies like this of the process because, as we'll see, it's very hard to detect. So right now, people are just basically looking at statistics of big maps and trying to pull out how the fluctuations in these maps are evolving with time. There are a number of experiments doing that. The current winner is called PAPER. Actually, it's the Donald C. Backer Precision Array to Probe the Epoch of Reionization, led by Aaron Parsons at Berkeley. And they have put the best upper limits on these fluctuations at a redshift of 8.4. And they started to rule out some, I wouldn't say lunatic models, but models that would have surprised most of the community. But they haven't gotten to the point where they can constrain reionization yet. Right. And that's basically for three reasons that make this hard. So this is a 1.4 gigahertz transition redshifted by a factor of 10. So 100 megahertz range, and that range is heavily used by people, of course, so you have to worry about that. It's also at the point where the ionosphere is starting to become refractive, and because these turn out to be very wide field imagers, like hundreds of square degrees, you have to worry about, it's basically an adaptive optics problem across a very wide field, but with low resolution. And then the worst problem is that this is not the only astrophysical signal in the sky. So the Milky Way synchrotron background is 10 or 100,000 times brighter than the cosmological signal we're looking for. Right? So there's this sort of unavoidable noise source that you have to get rid of. We've known for a long time how you want to get rid of that, which is basically that the synchrotron radiation has a smooth frequency structure, whereas our 21 centimeter signal varies rapidly in frequency as you look along a line of sight through ionized bubbles and neutral clumps and whatnot. Right? But in practice, that's really hard to do because of various instrumental effects. Right? What's been exciting over the last few years, and this has come out of a bunch of experiments that are all taking data and analyzing it furiously, including paper, is an understanding of how you can avoid this problem or deal with it. So it turns out if you plot your signal in Fourier space, so k-perp are Fourier modes that are aligned along the sky, and k-parallel is in the radial direction, right? All of these foregrounds have smooth frequency structure, so they intrinsically live down at small wave numbers in the radial direction over here, which is contaminated. And it turns out that all of those instrumental effects, at least to the precision of current measurements, screw up this wedge, okay, at the bottom right of here. So as long as you're working up here, which people call the EOR for epoch of reionization window, then you're okay. And you don't have to actually worry about all the foregrounds, except it's just a random noise source. Okay? So the current idea is basically to build an instrument, which we're calling the Hydrogen Epoch of Reionization Array, or HERA, that is designed to make this area as clean as possible. Ultimately, we want to work down here, which requires modeling your instrument and the foregrounds and their interaction. Okay? But we're going to build the instrument in such a way that we don't have to work down here in order to still get good information. All right, so the instrument, HERA, it's 352 14-meter antennas, which will go in the Karoo Desert in South Africa, which is near the future site of SKA Mid. And they're packed close together because we're looking at diffuse structures on the sky and trying to get as high a sensitivity as possible. This is an estimate of how well they can constrain the reionization history. Right, so redshift and neutral fraction. The gray area is basically what you can do if you don't have HERA. You just have existing constraints plus Planck. And the red is what we will get with HERA, the full array. And that build-out would be in about 4 years. Okay? So it's a dramatic improvement. I must say that this is in the context of a particular theoretical model of reionization. And so you still have to, the real spread will be larger than that if you factor in different models. But still, it's going to rule out a massive area of parameter space. This is also going to be the first instrument that could image the sky, only on coarse scales, okay? But the imaging is the point at which this percolation business becomes really important, because you need to understand the structures that you're seeing in detail in order to pull out science and not just say gee whiz. So I'm excited about the prospect of having something that can actually start to probe this era in detail. So HERA is the next proposal for HERA is going in tomorrow to the NSF. It's of order $20 million. So it's not small, but it's also not huge. And it's a collaboration between essentially the entire US community doing this kind of stuff. All right. So now I want to move back into theory, talk about the last phase of reionization. So one other key property that happens in these percolation problems is that you get a pair of percolation problems in any given system, right? Because you can imagine starting with the end where you're all filled squares and going backwards, while the white squares are then going to be the ones that are percolating. Right? So in the context of reionization, that means that if we go backwards in time from the end of reionization and you look at the neutral structures, they will also percolate. And in our boxes, we see that again at around, in this case, a neutral fraction of about 10%. Okay, you start to develop an infinitely long cluster. Now, the problem is, as we'll see in a minute, that we don't actually understand how to model this era in nearly as much detail as we do the earlier phases of reionization. So I don't actually trust these curves except insofar as they're showing us that you do get a percolation transition. All right, going back to what I said at the very beginning about this overlap picture of reionization, this percolation allows us to formalize that picture. Right? The pre-overlap phase is when you haven't yet reached the threshold, and so all of your ionized bubbles are finite and separated from each other, and so growing in isolation. But that doesn't last for very long at all. It ends by about 10% of the way through reionization. Past that point, you get this infinite ionized region which dominates the structures, and it's intertwined in some complicated way with a single infinite neutral region, right? Until that infinite neutral region fragments about 90% of the way through the process, and you burn off those last discrete neutral regions. Okay? All right, so that last phase, as I said, is very hard to model. The basic reason is because you have to start worrying about how you're losing photons to the IgM. So in my original model, I was just equating photons to ionized atoms. And in fact, some of those ionizing photons are going to be lost to recombinations. Okay? And because the universe is inhomogeneous, it turns out most of those recombinations are in little clumps, which are optically thick. So if your ionizing photon happens to hit one of those, it's wasted instead of contributing to reionization. As long as your bubbles are small, okay, then you don't have to worry much about this because most of your photons will hit the edge of a bubble before they hit one of these clumps. Right? But once the bubbles get big, then it becomes a problem. Right? And what these percolation theory results show is that the bubbles actually become infinitely large pretty quickly. So this is something to worry about. In order to understand it, we need to understand two things, which is the nature of the clumps that are doing the absorbing, and then how they interact with the ionizing background. Okay? So most of the absorption in redshifts at 5 and below come from things called Lyman limit systems, which we don't really understand. It's even harder at high redshifts. It turns out there's reason to believe that the nature of these Lyman limit systems changes at around the time of reionization. I'm not going to say anything more about that except that it's hard. I want to tell you a little bit about the interaction of the ionizing background in this, which is some work that my student has recently done. So George Becker and collaborators have been looking at high redshift quasar spectra for a while, and we've got quite a few of them. And one of the things they did recently was measure the average opacity in these regions over large lines of sight, so 50 H inverse megaparsecs, okay? And then look at how the dispersion, okay, between different lines of sight is evolving as you go to high redshift. So the mean value, a few things to notice in this plot. The mean value is evolving slowly for a while, and then it starts to increase rapidly. That used to be taken as a sign of reionization, but we now understand it's something about the evolving nature of the clumps and nothing to do directly with reionization. But in addition to that overall increase, you also get an increase in the scatter, okay? And it turns out that increased scatter is not consistent with standard models, at least as of models as we had them earlier this year. Basically because what's setting the ionizing background at these times is the galaxies, and there are a lot of galaxies in the universe, so the background ought to be pretty uniform. That's not what George et al. Found. This is the most dramatic example. So this is a quasar, which is out here, okay? And it has a region that is roughly 100 H inverse megaparsecs long with 0 Lyman alpha transmission in it. Okay, so this huge chunk of completely absorbed gas in the or light, that's these two lower limit points up here. So we set out to try to explain what might be causing this. All right, and the idea is basically that you do have to worry about fluctuations in the ionizing background. At lower redshifts, the mean free path of ionizing photons is hundreds of megaparsecs, so it's perfectly fine to take a uniform ionizing background. But at high redshifts, when things get denser and you have less emissivity, that turns out not to work. Okay, so for example, this region up here is a big void in our box, and so it's in a uniform ionizing background case, that void has very little gas, and so it's transparent. But if you allow for fluctuations in both the sources and in the absorbers, right, then there turns out to be a feedback cycle which amplifies fluctuations. And it turns your void from being a transparent region to being an opaque region. And it's opaque because there aren't any sources around, okay? And it ends up with a quite high opacity. So Fred implemented this in some numerical stuff. This will appear on AstroPH later this week. This is showing the difference between his fully consistent models, which are the ones with the deeper, more black, okay, to what people had done before, showing that when you do this properly, you get very large fluctuations that can more or less explain the distribution that George and collaborators see, which is this red line, or the black line, and then we can more or less reproduce it. The fun thing about this is that last week on AstroPH, an alternate explanation appeared from a former student of mine, Anson D'Aloisio, and Matt McQuinn. And not going to get into the details for reasons of time, but basically they say that rather than being fluctuations in the ionizing background, it could be differences in when different parts of the region of the universe were ionized. Basically, the longer something has been ionized, the more cooling it has undergone. The more cooling, the more recombinations, and so the more neutral it would be. Right? So they can also, more or less fit the distribution, but they make the opposite prediction for us for what those high optical depth environments would look like. So we say there are these voids because they don't have any sources to produce an ionizing background. They say they would be overdense regions because those overdense regions were the first ones to be ionized and so have cooled off the most. Right? So it'll be interesting to see which, well, possibility number one is that these effects cancel out and we still have no idea what's going on. Hopefully, at least one of them dominates, and we can use it to learn something interesting about the universe. All right, so that's it. As I said at the beginning, I ignored the whole story of how the first galaxies form in this talk. But if you want to know more, Avi Loeb and I wrote a book a couple years ago, so check that out. And I hope to see this field evolving very quickly in the near future between 21 centimeter experiments, frontier fields, all those things. There's a lot more data coming in, and it's an exciting time. Thanks.
You said, if I remember right, that at the 100 megahertz or what wavelengths of interest, the Milky Way is a terribly bright foreground. My question is, what's the ratio between, if you look in the plane, like the edge-on picture you gave, and if you look at the poles, and are the regions that are poles large enough to kind of address and answer observationally what you were asking?
So I forget if I said it. The quietest parts of the sky are about 10,000 times brighter than the cosmological signal. I actually don't know what the galactic center is. Probably many times brighter than that. But the best case is 10,000 times brighter. The instruments all sort of selectively choose fields that are, of course, as quiet as they can. How well you can do that depends on the particular instrument. So, for example, LOFAR, I think it's a 16 square degree beam, so it can zoom in pretty well on one of these quiet patches of the sky. The paper experiment is actually just dipoles, two cross dipoles, a field of 128 of them, and so they can't point at all. They're sensitive to the entire sky. So they throw out the data when Casset is up or something really bright. But they're basically drift scanning the entire sky at once. Hera will point to some degree, although it's still a quite big field of view because you need as big a field of view as you can when you're doing these statistical measurements just to get the volume that you want.
Thank you.
Could you say a little bit more when doing the models of how sort of patchy in the topology of the reionization regions, what the assumptions are for the underlying galaxy populations, in particular what mass systems are doing the reionizing? Because of course, depending on where you're in the mass function, you could be biased or unbiased tracers of the underlying density fluctuations.
So in the particular models that I showed, I was using the sort of most vanilla approach that we do, which is you assume that the smallest galaxy that can form stars has a virial temperature of 10 to the 4 Kelvin, so that's around 10 to the 8 solar masses. That number comes from, at that point, your gas can cool through atomic hydrogen transitions and form stars. And then I assume that the star formation, essentially the stellar mass is proportional to halo mass in there. So I'm not so I showed at the beginning that the star formation efficiency does appear to depend on stellar mass. I did not implement that in here, simply because this is the simple model that all the other theorists use. And so I was just using the most generic thing possible to look at this percolation. But it is an interesting question as to how the percolation properties would depend on the properties of the galaxies. So people have explored that in terms of power spectra of these fluctuations and stuff. And it turns out that the most important factor is kind of what's the mean bias of your galaxy population.
If you go down to too small a mass galaxy doing reionization, then you have to worry about bursting with the Lyman continuum production. And the source will turn on and off. And
Yeah, so we always ignore that because
what?
we always ignore that. For the purposes of modeling these reionized bubbles, basically, because so if you imagine a bursty source, it would shoot out a bunch of photons, produce an H2 region, and then if it were in isolation, that H2 region would begin to recombine. However, the recombination time is of order of Hubble time. So as long as you get another galaxy forming nearby within a Hubble time, you're pretty much going to be able to keep it ionized to the level that we can see it with a 21 centimeter experiment, for example, which would be a
small source of Lyman continuum, then the size of the H2 region may be
very small.
big,
Yeah.
and it may also be higher density material and have a quick
Yep.
recombination time.
Yeah.
But so, what is the mean mass of the source producing most of the Lyman continuum?
In the simulations I did here, it was slightly more than 10 to the 8 solar masses. So the mass function is very, very steep, and so whatever your minimum mass scale is dominates the production.
Other questions? You alluded in the plot from George Becker about showing the increase in the optical depths to redshift quasars as a change in understanding of that. Could you explain that a little?
Sure. So actually, all right. So here's a plot of measurements of the amplitude of the ionizing background as a function of redshift. Okay, and gamma is the amplitude. It's the rate at which any given neutral hydrogen atom would be ionized in the universe. And then all of these points are different measurements of this amplitude from the Lyman alpha forest. And you can see that the points disagree on the mean value, but all the sets of points are consistent with a flat ionizing background. So that has actually puzzled me for many years because we know that the sources are evolving quite rapidly. Both galaxies and quasars are evolving over these timescales. So why is gamma flat? It turns out you can understand that because the density, if you just plug in gamma and you want to know the density of a cloud that remains optically thick in the presence of this gamma, okay, at redshifts of 2, 3, or 4, it turns out that the density you need is a very high overdensity compared to the universal average. High enough that you must be associated with some kind of galaxy, or dark matter halo at least, okay? So as you increase the number of sources in the universe, you're increasing not only the light that you're producing, but also the number of these absorbers that are floating around. Okay, so that is why we think why it's flat. But if you go to high enough redshifts, right, the universe is getting denser and denser, and out above redshift of 5, the ionizing background is finally beginning to fall. And so if you repeat the calculation and you figure out what density of material do I need at redshift 5.5 in order to keep optically thick, it's now less than the density, the typical virial density of a halo, which means that your absorbers are no longer directly associated with your sources. They're out in the IGM. And so they're not going to evolve at the same rate. And so it turns out that this is, in that regime, quite sensitive to the underlying emissivity. So that's not to say that this is unrelated to reionization, but you can certainly explain it without making part of the universe neutral.
If the first 10% of reionization is the simplest, you still hope to learn something interesting about the ionizing sources, restricting your analysis just to that portion?
Definitely. In many ways, it would be easier to do so because then you're in a regime where you have finite bubbles, and that size distribution is a well-defined thing, right? So you can characterize the shape of the size distribution after the percolation begins, but it's only a few percent of the ionized gas that's in these discrete structures. You're not going to detect them anyway, and you just need to interpret that infinite bubble. So, I mean, I've been really just starting to dive into understanding this infinite thing, but the finite ones that happen in the very early stages should be straightforward.
So in the reionization models, you associate the ionizing photons with density peaks, and I suppose those peaks are basically magnetic fields or three-dimensional gas objects. But in realistic density field, there are a lot of filaments and sheets, and they consist of much larger amount of baryonic mass. So I wonder, so how that can make a difference, in particular that percolation model.
Yeah, so I am using in this, so I guess two things to say. One is I'm using a very low resolution, a coarse box. So effectively my resolution is like a megaparsec. So I'm not resolving those filaments in any way. But I did mention that there was this simulation from many years ago that noted that this happened there as well by Ilya Ilyev. And that was a genuine radiative transfer simulation, fairly high resolution. And they found that this infinite box or infinite cluster appeared at an ionized fraction of like 12 or 13%, I think. So pretty close to what I'm getting even in a higher resolution simulation. But definitely, yeah, it's not clear if because you have more sources strung out along these filaments, it's easier to ionize them overall, or if it's easier to kind of cut across and do the middle. I'm not sure about that yet.
Just one more question.
It's more of an anecdote, but I took a radio astronomy course from Rick Bradley, who built the paper array, and it was while they were still figuring everything out. And so our coursework was all with preliminary data from paper and also characterizing all the receivers. So I'm really happy to see we didn't break everything because it was terrifying to be in the lab where they're building all the detectors and everything. And they will make you touch things and turn things. But also we were figuring out in our coursework, which was kind of awful, a lot of the issues about the interference. And so we were just given data sets and had to figure out based on the time and where it was in the sky, what was interfering. And so you could actually see when people were driving home because you get this spike at certain frequencies when they turn on their radios. Because up in Green Bank, West Virginia, there's only one radio station. And things like that. It was really, really powerful. I mean, really fun to do, but awful at the same time. So I'm just really happy to see that paper's doing really great.
Yeah,
So
it's.
really
I was a little discouraged for a while about this field. So when I started in this game, it was 2003, and MWA, the Murchison Wide Field Array, was just proposing, and LOFAR was being built, and everybody was saying in 5 years we're going to have data and everything. And then in 2012, they were still saying in 5 years we're going to have data. But now that this wedge and EOR window discovery really seems to have advanced things at a very rapid clip. So I'm hopeful that the 4-year Hera plan is more reliable than the 5-year MWA plan.
And the antennas on the moon plan is still, because we used to also hear about that.
Yes.
So that's still alive.
That's, well, you know, it's NASA. Things don't die there.
So, a kind of crazy question, is it impossible to, if you had a space satellite with, you know, state-of-the-art detectors, big pixels, to see H alpha from reionization?
It's not impossible, no. So one of the, NASA just had a small Explorer round, and one of the proposals that got Phase A funding is called SphereX. It's led by Jamie Bach, and it does a number of things, but one of the things it can do is look for fluctuations in Lyman alpha emission from the reionization era. So it's near infrared.
A spectrum of fluctuation?
A spectrum, like essentially a spectrum of all the pixels on the sky at several arc-minute resolution, I think.
But actual imaging would not be possible?
On what scale? I mean, I'm sure it's possible.
On the scale of the reionization bubbles.
So the reionization bubbles are that characteristic scale that I showed. The radius was like in the middle of reionization, 10 to 100 megaparsecs. So they're huge.
15 arc minutes or something.
Yeah, it's very diffuse. And then so you're thinking of H alpha from like recombinations in those. That is not, unfortunately, possible. People have talked about imaging. The recombination signal is actually strongest within the ionization front itself, because that's where the gas is hot, and the ionized and neutral fractions are both high for the interaction rate. So people have tried to image basically the edges of the ionized bubbles around quasars and stuff like that. But my student, Fred Davies, who did this work on the ionizing background, also has a recent paper where we show that, unfortunately, the signal is about an order of magnitude too small to see reasonably.
Okay, thanks, Steve, again.